F1 primarily focused on, but motorsport in general, love every bit of it. Just give me a bit of everything. For me, the one that came to mind immediately there was when I got to interview Carlos Sainz Sr., when he was racing in Extreme E back in its first season. And luckily, I was able to temper it during the interview as to not have a complete fanboy moment for just the entire time and just go, oh my God, it's Carlos Sainz Sr. and just nib those thoughts in the bud quite quickly so I can actually get on with it. You can have a really great headline, but if it doesn't have the keywords in it, you're frustratingly not going to get the traction that you want of it, even though it's something absolutely bonkers and should draw everyone in. And this will be the controversial part. If he continues as he is, no, I don't think he's going to win a championship. I think this year has been the best opportunity he's had for it. If you told me that I'd be still doing it 5 years ago, I'd be going, well, that's worked out a bit better than you probably thought.
Pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
Criminal.
Hello and welcome to the final episode of the third season of Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. I'm your host, F1 Blag. And it's fitting that we go out with a brilliant guest. Thiemo Albers-Daly is an FIA accredited journalist. What does that mean, you ask? Well, you can hear from the man himself. Thiemo's work has featured in some of the most popular motorsport publications. And, as if he were not busy enough, he runs not one, not two, not three, but 4 podcasts. So who better to finish the season with, to look ahead to 2025, and indeed ask the crucial question, who on the current Formula One grid is most likely to win their first World Drivers' Championship? I'd like to take a quick moment to say it's been a real pleasure hosting, recording and editing this season of the podcast, and I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. Without further ado, welcome to the show, Thiemo Albers-Daly.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
The first thing we always ask our guests is if you're introducing yourself to our listeners, who is Thiemo? How would you introduce yourself?
Where to start? Like you say, multiple podcasts. It's tricky to know where to start sometimes, isn't it? I would say that I'm a motorsport journalist, and that has become something where I've fallen down that rabbit hole pretty quickly, as you can probably gather from a quick Google search. It was Formula One from the beginning. Obviously, it had to be. It is with so many people, but then it never really was going to stay there. It went into the feeder series. It went into IndyCar. It's gone into off-roading, and then Nitrocross, kind of combining these things as well. So kind of F1 primarily focused on, but motorsport in general, love every bit of it. Just give me a bit of everything.
Amazing. Passion for motorsport seems to be the theme running through all of our guests this season.
I need it.
Yeah, right. Inject it to the veins. So we love to ask if people have a vivid first memory of motorsport. Like, what's the first thing you can remember about seeing a motor car or something like that?
I don't know if it'd be the first, but I always remember Michael Schumacher in the Ferraris back in the early 2000s. It's as close to as time point as I can get. It was one of these situations where I remember watching it on a Sunday morning or an afternoon, and in particular one memory does stand out where, because of their domination at the time and because of how young I was, 2 and 2 didn't make sense on the one occasion where I didn't see 2 Ferraris lining up on the front row of the grid, because I thought that was just how it was supposed to be. Every race we'd seen this, and I had to ask, why are the Ferraris not starting at the front? That's just the rules, isn't it? No. And then it kind of, the fascination grew from there, and kind of, like you say, you had Schumacher, and then I think you got into Alonso era, and then you got into all of the rest of it, and it kind of stemmed from there. And I talk about this with a friend of mine regularly who's been watching it for a similar amount of time that I have, that somehow it's been nearly best part of 20 years since we started watching, and we feel quite old because of that.
No, the 10 to the 20 tends to go past incredibly quickly.
Yes.
Well, that Michael Schumacher Ferrari image is indelibly marked in many people's memory, but not everyone then goes, okay, I'm going to become an FIA accredited motorsport journalist. So what was the journey between kind of loving motorsport as a kid through to becoming a journalist?
It was one of those things for me where it was just always there in the back, and there was this through line with it. And I'd gone through school, I'd gone through university, and I'd done lots of different areas that I'd found interesting and fascinating, and thought to myself, what do I want to do? And there were other avenues open to me, and still might investigate some of those at one point. But I had the idea, I suppose, to try my hand at it back in 2019 when I first really started. I watched this YouTube video that James May had done for promoting Drive Tribe back when that was a massive thing, and he was saying that as much as he was doing a lot of self-promotion for his own platform, it was also something he wished he'd had when he was growing up, because it's a great place, and it was a great place to kind of find your feet and try a little bit of everything, see what kind of journalism you might fit into, see if you're actually any good at it to start off with, and if you aren't, what can you do to improve it, and don't just give up straight away. And because everybody was contributing, from the most broad-based stuff of what was going on in the latest Grand Prix to the most niche thing in classic cars, for example, or some motorsport series that no one had ever heard of except the 5 people who maybe were trying to get it off the ground. You could have everything. And then there's all sorts of things with automobiles beyond that. So when that happened, I thought, well, you know what? I like to dissect a Grand Prix after a weekend. There's not always enough people, because at this point, Drive to Survive hadn't really turned up yet, I don't think, or it wasn't really that big. And I thought, be a good way to start off it. So I was reviewing Grand Prix, I was putting those up, they got a bit of traction, and then you just start building a little bit of a network, a bit of community amongst all of that, and you try your hand at a bit of different things, and you're passionate with the history from it, and it just kind of grew from there, and that turned into interviewing some racing drivers here in the UK. And at that point, the old phrase of "if you don't ask, you don't get" kind of very much came into my mind, and I just started asking people for interviews, and that method works far too well, it must be said, in terms of the success rate. It shouldn't work as straightforwardly as it does half the time, not that I'm complaining. And yeah, just grew from there. And I think once that first 6 months to a year maybe of doing it as more of a hobby passed, I thought, you're not too bad at this. You're getting some decent feedback, and you're allowed to be expressing in your own style here because of Drive Tribe going, we're welcoming whatever you want to do here, as long as you're respectful, as long as you do all of that sort of thing. Then disagree with each other as much as you like, promote conversation, get really stuck into the weeds of the details and go for it. And I loved doing that, and I loved finding the interesting stories that maybe people hadn't come across yet. And the same then when interviewing drivers, I'd be coming across people who back then no one really knew anything about, and now if I'd say a couple of names to you, you'd go, oh yeah, I know this person, and they've blown up in various different ways, and I loved doing that. So once you start doing that, it becomes quite addictive.
Yeah, and I think if you have the passion for motorsport, then I don't know about you, but some of it feels like a privilege. Like you get to talk to all these people that are in motorsport, or that they love motorsport, and it's energizing. I mean, going back to those early days, do you remember the first interview you did, also where you were like, "Wow, I can't believe it"?
I had one as you were talking before you even asked the question, that I remember thinking, yeah, that was one where I think sometimes because of schedules and all these sorts of things for any driver, any individual, generally you always wonder, oh, am I gonna be available? Is there something going to be kind of turning up last minute? Are they going to forget, or is there going to be something more important? Because again, you have this. I think if you're doing it in the right way, if you have that approach, you do treat it like a privilege. You just think, oh, it's just little old me. They've got much more important things to be doing right now than just having a conversation. But you then appreciate the time that's been taken to chat with you. And for me, the one that came to mind immediately there was when I got to interview Carlos Sainz Sr. When he was racing in Extreme E back in its first season. And luckily, I was able to temper it during the interview as to not have a complete fanboy moment for just the entire time, and just go, oh my god, it's Carlos Sainz Sr., and just nib those thoughts in the bud quite quickly so I can actually get on with it. But then afterwards, you just log off and you just go, just had a half-hour, 40-minute conversation with one of the biggest stars of motorsport from the last 3 or 4 decades, and that's just my Wednesday morning. That's not my whole day. That's just a part of my day at this point, and that's just a bit mad. And I do like those pinch me moments, and I think equally you get that satisfaction from some of these drivers, like I said just now, where you find them interesting to start off with, because as long as they've got a different story, from what you've heard before, which once you get past the I watched F1 growing as a kid, because we all have that, it does tend to branch off a bit then. And then you see a year or two down the line where they've got to. It's quite fun and quite satisfying and a bit more of a privilege in that way to go, oh, everyone obviously knows them now. It's easy to know someone when they're big, but it's quite fun to know them before everyone else did and to see that as well. So you get different kinds of privileges where you get Carlos Sainz Sr. on the one hand where you go, holy cow, that's my morning. And then on the other hand you go, I wonder where you're going to end up. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that career progression. And you can have wildly different stories on that side of things as well.
Absolutely. Any particular sort of young drivers that you interviewed a few years back that have become more prominent since then that you would like to mention?
There were a couple that did stand out to me as well. Again, it's quite fun how you're talking about this, bringing back names immediately. I'm like, I know exactly where I'm thinking of there. There was a Dakar driver, now a rally driver in general off-road, where when she first came onto my radar a few years ago, she'd never raced before. And she'd done a bit of training, but she wanted the classic Dakar to be her first ever race. And I thought immediately, this is going to go one or two ways. She's either going to nail this, or I'm never going to hear from her again. There's no middle ground. And I kind of like the all or nothing approach there. And that was Rebecca Boosie. And she's since gone on to just skyrocket, as you may know, and as people listening and watching may know as well. And I think she finished in P3 in her category in the World Rally Raid Championship this year. It's just a few years later, and I was like, I've been watching it, I've been keeping track of all of the races she's been doing since then, and just to see that going from, I didn't know an awful lot about that side of motorsport because I was more track-based at that point, but I was like, this woman has just decided she's going to do the most difficult race on the planet, arguably, as her first one. I'm interested, and I want to see what happens here. And then on the other side of that, you have someone like Bianca Bustamante, who, again, everyone who knows motorsport knows who she is now, and it's quite interesting to see how, at the time, I think she'd just been doing a test in W Series, perhaps, but wasn't anywhere near as big as she is now. And I was thinking, this is going to be interesting. And then you see, I think at the start of this year, perhaps, or tail end of last year, years are very long at the moment, when she joined McLaren as one of the driver developers, and go, damn, that's massive for her. And all the kind of things that come with that. And you think, you never know who's going to be the next big one. You have ideas, and I'm still waiting for a couple of them maybe because I still think there's something there. But again, it just kind of makes you go, don't take any of it for granted. Treat everyone really kind of the same in that respect. Have that, take the time with them, be interested in their stories. They've all got interesting stories, and you do never know where they're going to end up. And I think it's quite fun then to get that unique perspective, like I say, of knowing people before everyone else does, because you see a rawer version, I think, of an unfiltered one, whereas they haven't had the time for the media training necessarily. They might mess up a little more. You might see a bit more of the real person. And that's something I think I don't know if you get less of it these days, but they've been better trained to hide certain elements of themselves, whereas you get to catch them a little bit off guard, but in a natural way where you're not going to use it against them. And I kind of love that just natural feeling of that when you're talking. It's like you're just sitting down in a pub or in a park or whatever and just having a chat with someone.
Yeah, absolutely. You were talking about telling stories, and obviously we're talking about upward trajectory of drivers, but talking about yourself, what were the big lessons you learned, starting fresh as a journalist to where you are now? Were there some big learning moments, a steep learning curve?
In some ways, yes. I think the one thing that stood out to me most was the good thing about having something as big as Drive as the starting place, because you could do whatever you wanted. Obviously, there's a little asterisk of within reason, but generally speaking, you could do what you wanted. And I think not being afraid to just try out different things. When one time I'd be going for a historical F1 piece, or I'd be going for something a bit more left field and going, did you know this about this? Or do you want to do a poll on the Grand Prix, or do you want to do a poll on some really crackpot idea you had at 2 a.m. that you think, oh, that's absolutely brilliant, let's see what everyone else thinks. And then trying to hone and learn from that as much as possible, because at that point it was global. And you had kind of a poster's dream in some respects. You could find someone to suit your needs and broad enough demographic to get enough feedback that would be constructive. And I think when that closed, then the other lesson would be trying to figure out what do you do from here. You don't have this massive sandbox to play in now, but there are lots of other ones around the place. You just need to know where to look. And luckily, you've been able to spend however long I was there, 2 to 3 years, kind of getting all the bad habits necessarily, or try all the bad stuff now here where you can get away with it so that you can do better later on. And I think that's the same with interviews in some respects. You figure out which questions or which kind of behaviors match everyone to at least get off on the right foot. So then if you diverge off into a story, that's fine as well. Maybe you don't ask all your questions. Maybe you don't need to. And then some other things, you've got a very left field question. Maybe it's a bit too left field and someone's manager or someone's team doesn't like that as much, and you kind of curb that for next time. It's that sort of thing. And again, luckily not too many of those, but it's also something where you think in your head, that's perfectly fine. But you can't always see all sides of everything. You need to have that, and I think that's the one thing there. I think the biggest learning curve there was, I don't know if there was the learning curve. It was just the fact that I got the opportunity to learn such a vast amount that in other scenarios, if I'd start where I am now, for some of the other places, I might not have got that because there just wasn't that audience as much. And you have that in a way now with social media, but I don't feel like it's the same, because you get it very kind of targeted and filtered in terms of what you can get back in terms of feedback sometimes as well. So I think just the biggest learning curve was being able to get the feedback that was actually useful.
Yeah, I mean, feedback, all of us are on social media. We know, like, instinctively, if we do a tweet or something, if it's going to get traction. And maybe not everyone has pulled apart, okay, well, it was because it was to the point and, it had an image that was resonant and so on. So I wonder if you're doing written journalism, whether there are certain elements to a story that are fundamentals that you have everywhere, or that you think are necessary to make your article attractive and accessible to everyone. And there are a few things that sandbox and that feedback taught you.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've got the classic for journalism across the board, not just motorsport, of the who, what, when, where, when, why, and how, that sort of thing. And you need the catchy title, but you need it these days to fit with SEO if you're actually going to get any traction, because you can have a really great headline, but if it doesn't have the keywords in it, you're frustratingly not going to get the traction that you want of it, even though it's something absolutely bonkers and should draw everyone in. That's just unfortunately the world we live in a bit now, where if you don't have F1 in the title for a Formula One article, you may miss out on the biggest audience possible. So I think those two primarily are the things there. And I think as well, you just need to trust that I think the title of the SEO is the strong point there. And I think if you've got a good image to go with it, people who are not even interested in motorsport, they'll see an eye-catching image, or they'll see the combination of the SEO with hopefully the catchy title you've managed to smash together. And even if they don't have any clue about F1 or motorsport or whatever, they'll take a look at it because it's been intrigued. And then it's not that the content of the article or the interview doesn't matter then, but they're already there. You've already got them there. So they're more likely then to go through the rest of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting that we talk to people from all parts of motorsport and sort of life in general. And perhaps it's human nature to underestimate that the presentation of something is just so important. Even though the content you could slave away on it. It could be kind of the Mona Lisa of articles, and without the right presentation and marketing, it doesn't get there. Speaking of which, your lovely LinkedIn, FIA accredited freelance motorsport journalist. So how do you get FIA accredited? Does it mean you can go trackside? Do you have credentials? How does that all work?
Yeah, basically there was a bit of paperwork. That was the short version of it. There was a bit of paperwork, and you need to keep on top of it to make sure that it stays up to date, which is the good reminder for me to make sure I've got that all in order for next year. But basically, it allowed me to combine with Drive Tribe back in 2021 to go and be trackside for the Extreme E finale down in Dorset there. So I got to go and be in the media tent, got to have that kind of fun stuff there and be recognised. And it wasn't just a media thing, it was kind of, there was a bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? A bit more Oh, I've completely lost the word now. I'm trying to think. This is ironic for a journalist, isn't it? Kind of gives you more credentials, I suppose, for it. Kind of gives you more of a reputation, and backs up that you are who you say you are. You're not just somebody trying to blag their way in. And that was also what helped me get into the Formula E season finale this year down in London for the doubleheader there. That was good fun. And it's just a way of being recognised a bit more immediately. So it's pretty straightforward. And I think as long as you've got somewhere where you can publish your work, and it can be social media. I saw a lot of content creators there who they just do it off their own back and they're trying to make it their own way. Some very doing it very well, others starting off. And again, it's just sorting out the people that are taking it seriously and want to go a particular route, but then you've got other people who they want to do their own thing and they don't need to be accredited for it. But it's kind of, if you want to try and get a bit more into the official channels, as it were, and see what you can get up to there, then that is the way forward. And I think for now that's what I want to try and do, because again, if you go for too freelance, then you see how wide that kind of spread is in terms of content creators in general, and that can be even more of a free for all.
Absolutely. And, I was about to switch us on to talk about podcasting because that's another area you're in. But the analogy is there in terms of, I would say, when you started out in 2019, when you described it, if I was a humble member of F1 Twitter, as I still am, and perhaps it was the surge of Drive to Survive combined with the surge of people being more online post-COVID has kind of hugely saturated the number of people that are saying that they're freelance content creators or saying that they're podcasters. So how did you decide the time is right to do a podcast? And at the time, would you say it wasn't as a busy space as it is today?
Definitely wasn't as busy as it is now. It wasn't quiet either, but I think, like you say, COVID and everything else since then has just massively exploded that area, and everyone and their dog has at least one podcast, which is why I had to go and make like 4 of them so I could stand out a bit. But for me, it just came as a natural thing. As I said earlier, when I started interviewing people for Drive Tribe, one of the first group of people really was an all disabled team over here in the UK called Team Brit, and this is another one of these cases where don't ask, don't get. I'd sent an email to the team saying, would it be possible to interview you? I'd seen a piece that Sky F1 had done on them. They wanted to be the first all-female team, sorry, that's force I have, but all-disabled team to get to Le Mans and compete there. And again, I thought, that's different. We've not really had too much of that before, as far as I'm aware. So this would be great to try and chat to either the guy in charge or a couple of the drivers or this or that. And their PR person came back and said, sure, would you like to chat to all of the drivers? And I was like, yes. And then I'm thinking, where am I going to do all of this? Because some of it could be written, but then I was thinking some of the drivers are saying, oh, yeah, let me know when you want to do a video call and we can record it that way, as they were kind of leading me there, assuming that was going to be the format. And I thought, I'm not against that, but I've nowhere to put that. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. I was just going for the written stuff. And it was at that point I thought, well, if I can get these people, I can probably get some other people down the line, and it would be fun to have a face-to-face as much as you could back then, as well, especially as this was all just before COVID, to put it somewhere and for it to either be a podcast or a video podcast, depending on the preferences, because I always like to make sure that if you're not happy with it to be a visual medium, then at least we get the audio for it so that everyone's as comfortable as it can be. Because again, once everyone feels natural, they're more likely to open up and be the authentic self with you. And I had a couple of interviews with those drivers in the can, and I thought YouTube seems the place for this. So again, really didn't have much of a plan in mind at that point. I was just like, I need to put it somewhere so that people can watch it, because I've interviewed the guy now. It's got to go somewhere. And then I thought, I suppose people are doing podcasts these days. I could do something along those lines. Need a name for it. Then you go through about 1 million different names in your head of stuff that is probably already taken or sounds terrible. And then, as is often the case, just out walking one day and On the Kerbs came to mind, and miraculously when I gave it a Google, there was nothing really there for it. There was some interesting stuff about concrete, but that wasn't really what I was going for. So I went with that for it, got a couple of graphics whipped up, and the rest went from there. And sure enough, I then managed to get Christine GZ on. I got Matthias Ekstrom on pretty early doors as some of the bigger name drivers, and then, like you say, you shoot out 100 emails, and much to my surprise, about 80 then come back, which was a much higher percentage rate than I was expecting, because again, maybe it was this COVID situation that was going on. It was just about to come around the corner and people just had more time on their hands, but I benefited from that in that respect. And after that, it just made sense to keep doing it, keep pumping it out. I kept finding people that were interesting to me, and like I say, everyone's got a different story, and as long as it's interesting for good, bad, or ugly reasons, I don't really mind. It's a good story, and I'm there for it. So if I'm finding it interesting, I hope other people are too, but it's almost a selfish endeavour in that respect, that I don't need you to watch it. I'm doing this for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, I in a way, yeah. If you're a motorsport aficionado, you're going to get a lot out of it. But equally, I think, as you're showing, there is some satisfaction out of getting more eyes or ears on. I can tell you that one of the proudest podcasts or episodes that I've done is with Mario Andretti, and it's like the one I always think of when I think of a previous episode because of who he is. But then there are some other ones that I've done with people that perhaps are less famous, but the actual conversation was something that I'll remember forever. So do you have any episodes that you reflect on and think, I'm really proud of that, or, whoa, that was a big one for me?
There's so many to choose from in that respect, because like you say, you've got these big names, like I was saying, Carlos Sainz earlier, you have that kind of pinch me moment, but then you have drivers where some of them, they do make it up to the higher levels, but then others, they're very much content in their field, and they just want to do it. It's not a hobby for them, but they're not doing it with a specific end goal in mind. They're just doing it for the love of the sport, and that's also a really interesting conversation. And the other side of it is the fact that most of the time you're messaging someone, and then you see them for the interview, and you have to figure out pretty damn quickly how to get on with them, because you're meeting, as much as you may know them, a virtual stranger for the first time, and you've got to get them to open up to you in half an hour, 40 minutes maximum most of the time. A couple of cases it's an hour if you're lucky, and you've got to figure out a way to get that dynamic to go. And I think that's one of the other really rewarding bits of it, is that your social skills do develop a lot in that respect there, and absolutely crucial to try and maintain that during the various lockdowns we had for however long there. Kind of my social life is racing drivers, which isn't too bad, I think, to be able to get out of that either. I'm trying to think. There've been several conversations, and luckily it's been something that hasn't been just isolated to a particular year. It's been kind of, again, a through line where I can't remember most of the conversations off the top of my head, but I just know that X person, we just got along. It was just a good chat, and it was a kind of thing, like you say, you just happen to meet someone at a bar, or you just meet someone randomly somewhere else, and you just happen to click. And if you don't, it's okay. I've had a couple of those interviews as well, where it feels a little bit like you're trying to pull teeth and you're trying to get blood from a rock sort of thing, but it's part of the game. You kind of enjoy that aspect as well, because you're like, okay, it's a bit more of a challenge. I can enjoy this, and let's see why this is an issue. What's going on here? Have I done something? Have I missed something? Or is it just them? What is it here? And I think that's the other side of the natural conversation that you can enjoy then, because you're not going to get on with everyone as well as you would like to. And it might not be for any particular reason. It's just, you just aren't people that aren't going to be best buddies, and that's okay. But as long as you get a natural talk out of it, then that's the main thing for me.
No, I agree. And absolutely, you kind of get that diversity of personality, and you learn as you go. Speaking of learning, I had no idea until I was today years old that Kerbs is spelt with a K, Kerb. I've always been spelling it curb, like the verb to curb your enthusiasm. So, you've taught me that on the Kerbs. But you have other podcasts. So tell us about that progression. You've got On the Kerbs, you've got The Undercut, you've got Nitrocross, and then recently Across the Pond. Like, in what order did that happen, and what were the motivations behind this?
Pretty much that order, to be honest with you. So that's the easy bit sorted. But On the Kerbs, that was the initial one. Like I say, I had interviews. I needed to put them somewhere. People started emailing me back saying, yes, you can interview us. I'm going, oh, damn, I've actually got to do this now. Right, let me figure that out. So that just kind of spawned, and that got a little bit silly after a while. I've had to not scale that back a little bit, but I had a year where there was at least one episode a week, every week for a year. And it gets quite a lot, especially when you have 3 or 4 interviews a day, but then you're trying to make sure they're staggered so that everyone gets enough breathing room because you don't want to oversaturate your own market, and just make sure that the drivers or whoever it is you're talking to in the world of motorsport get their own time, because you don't want to have one driver feel like they're being prioritized or not prioritized over another. So that was that main thing, and that keeps going. I'll keep doing that for as long as I kind of want to. That's the main passion project, I think, because like I said earlier, I don't need that to blow up in certain respects. That's just personal satisfaction and getting to chat with people, and they get something out of it, I get something out of it, so it's all good. The Undercut came through Drive Tribe. It was initially meant to be the Drive Tribe F1 podcast. We started back in 2021 for, I'm trying to think, what was our first one? Possibly the Mexican Grand Prix, I think. And it was myself and one of my co-hosts, Jesse Billington, who we decided, let's do an F1 podcast. We're already chatting enough about it. Let's just record it and then just upload it. Let's just see if that. Let's try and be a little bit productive with it, at least, rather than just us nattering to ourselves. Let's bore other people with our opinions. And then that went well. We got some other people to join us as guests for some of those Grand Prix afterwards. And then at the start of 2022, Drive Tribe shut down. So we thought, it's a shame, we've just set up all this infrastructure. We'd like to keep it going in some regard. What do we do? So we came up with a name for the podcast, the Undercut Podcast. I thought, again, very much on brand with motorsport. And I think we did a few episodes, because luckily it was all in the off season that this happened, so it didn't impact us too badly. We weren't missing like half a season trying to figure out what the hell to do. So in that respect, good timing. And then I think it was around March, I think, of that year, she hadn't been on yet onto the podcast. She'd written some excellent articles on Drive Tribe, kind of doing the main takeaways, the key takeaways from each Grand Prix weekend. And this was Ellie May, the third host for the podcast. And when she came on and joined us full time, because she was initially just as a guest, and then we'd had that episode for, I think, the Australian Grand Prix of that year. Or was meant to be, possibly. Don't know if it happened or not. It's all get blurred together at this point, I think. It just kind of clicked, and we're like, we need to keep her. She's adding a good dynamic here that we're all right on our own, but she's helping seal this all together. It's kind of, if you only ever have Clarkson or Hammond or Clarkson and May, you're missing a third element somewhere. You need the third one, and she's luckily been here ever since. So we've just been doing that, and again, Formula One has just blown up massively, even more so than somehow it already was at that point. It's never been small, so it's been perfect from that respect. And we bicker a lot, but it's in a good, productive way. And occasionally we do agree. We've been agreeing far too much recently. I don't know what that says about us or about the sport. We've figured that one out maybe over a psychology session, but that's been great to do from there. And then as a result of that, we've been able to talk more about the feeder series as we get into that. And we've interviewed a couple of drivers here and there, and hosted a pub quiz a couple of years ago. Hopefully get to do something similar soon, and just kind of build out the network that way. Nitrocross amusingly came off the back of a driver interview that I did for On the Kerbs, where the co-host I have for that podcast, she herself was a rally driver, had to stop, and I was intrigued by that story, so I interviewed her, and then she said, oh, there's this thing starting up called back then Nitro Rallycross. I was thinking maybe we could do a podcast on this if you'd be interested. You seem like the kind of guy that would be interested in doing that. I had no idea what the hell she was talking about, so I thought, right, let me YouTube quickly, let me have a Google, because there'd been a couple of rounds the year before, I think, kind of special one-off events, and it looked a bit of fun. I hadn't really watched too much of World Rallycross up to that point, but it looked like World Rallycross on steroids, where they have these gap jumps and all kinds of different vehicles, taking it a little bit less seriously. It wasn't an official FIA motorsport series. And I just thought, you know what? Why not? There's not enough events. There's a small enough number of events spread throughout the year where I can afford to take a bit of time to dive into this world, and let's just see what happens. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. I've not lost too much time either. And then that turned out to be a really fun, and still is a really fun, motorsport series to watch. And you've got some absolutely bonkers action. I mean, they have the top end of it where they've got these 1,000 brake horsepower electric cars that go over gap jumps that just seem to get bigger and bigger. But then on the other end of the same weekend, you've got about 15 people racing Herbies, essentially, around the similar track. Luckily, they don't do the gap jump. I don't think they'd make it. They don't get the speed up enough to get over the thing in the first place. But you've got just this family atmosphere around with all the drivers and all the teams and everyone there. They don't take it too seriously, except for when they really do on track against each other, but that seems fair enough. And that just seemed a really natural way into that world. And we've been lucky enough to chat to so many of the drivers and people behind the scenes there already. We've got more stuff coming up whilst we figure out what's going on with the rest of that series. And then earlier this year, there was the Across the Pond podcast that you mentioned there, where I was approached for their IndyCar podcast, which luckily for me, I'd been watching that more seriously for the past couple of years, so I had a bit of an idea of what was going on there, so I could actually maybe talk about it. They needed a new co-host, and I thought, well, at this point, I'm collecting podcasts like Infinity Stones. Why not have one more? So that's exactly what I did, and it's been a good first year. I think you can tell from the first episode to the most recent one, I have learned a lot more about it, and that is in part due to the co-host I have for that, Nate, who he's been watching American motorsport for decades. So what he doesn't know, and I do try to catch him out, and it only works about 2% of the time, isn't worth knowing. He's got all the numbers and all the stats and everything in his head, and I kind of I'm a sponge and learn from him then. But then also IndyCar's just been a really entertaining series, so it's been really easy to commentate about it and to discuss it, and again, find that repertoire with the co-host that I've been lucky enough to have across all of the podcasts, to make it seem really easy and just as if we've known each other forever, and when in reality we chat maybe once or twice a week, and the majority of the time our longest interactions are the ones you hear, and it just comes across really naturally. So that's how that happened, and it's just kind of like I say, once you step into the world of motorsport, it's like the mafia. You can't really get out.
No, well, I mean, hopefully in a good way, right? You don't want to leave.
Yeah.
So it's a cult. It's fine. It's interesting that your latest venture is on IndyCar, and I share your assessment that it's a brilliant series. Try not to compare it to Formula One in terms of car performance, but the wheel-to-wheel action is incredible, and also the level of competition. So do you have a driver that you root for? Are you studiously neutral? How do you stay up on the Sunday night when there's a West Coast Grand Prix? All these questions come to mind.
I'll admit some days I see the time and I go, that's going to be an extended highlights, and I'm going to thank God that he takes such detailed notes that it's like I'm virtually there anyway. So the combination has saved me on a couple of occasions, but most of the time I work things around and I just stay up. In terms of supporters and drivers, IndyCar, you probably won't believe, but it's a lot easier to stay neutral there for me. There's names that I obviously now I'm very familiar with, but at the start of I was going, okay, I know about 3 or 4 people because you've either been in F1 or you've been in the feeder series and you didn't make it to F1, but you've now in IndyCar and maybe this is better suited to you. And so I was like, I want you to do well, but I don't need you to. It's just I've got skin in the game, I'm familiar with you, and it just makes the sport and the series easier to watch because there's a vested interest. It's a little bit like when you're watching Formula 3 for me these days. You've got 13 drivers there, and you want to be able to just enjoy it as a race, but it helps if you know 1 or 2 people so you can go, okay, hopefully they do well. Maybe they don't, but at least you've got that extra bit of personal skin in the game. But most of the time it's been easy to stay neutral, and then off the back of that, particularly this season, as I've been analysing it way more than I was doing the past 2 seasons, where I just tune in, watch, enjoy, and then that'd be kind of it. You get to see all of these drivers develop over a year, and I'm coming into it going, I know a lot of the drivers by name, but I'm not sure what to expect from them. I know what he's expecting from them because he's been watching them for the last 20 plus years, and he's probably been watching since before some of these guys were born, and that's fair enough. But I'm not quite there yet. I'm like that with F1, but I'm not like that with IndyCar. So I think just being open to knowing that I don't know everything about that series, and I definitely still don't, but I'm a lot better now than where I was at the beginning of the season, has helped with that. And in terms of support, then it's made it easier to appreciate drivers that I didn't know what to expect, or you expect more from them if you're a veteran spectator. But for me, I was kind of like, well, I don't really have any expectations for anyone. Even the names I'm familiar with, just because you maybe weren't the best driver in this other series doesn't mean you're going to be bad here. We see this a lot of the time with transferable skills in motorsport. You can be superb in single seater, but we stick you in a rally car, you might be terrible, and vice versa. It's just how that happens. So it's nice to have that fresh approach, and I think that's how you can stay neutral in that respect. Whereas in F1, more difficult.
Well, I mean, let's go to F1 in a second, but I really loved what you said. I might want you to win, but I don't need you to. And that's beautiful. You know, we can root for more than one driver, and we're certainly not going to be rooting against anyone. And you talked also about drivers that perhaps you knew before. And you know, I'm secretly very, very happy for Marcus Ericsson, because I think he was a bit maligned in Formula One. Oh, you know, pay driver, and he was in whatever Sauber was called for the 5 years that he was in Formula One. People thought, okay, he was going to leave and he'd still be there the next year. And yet he's won a Indy 500 and probably should have won another if they'd followed the general protocol of having 2 warm-up laps. So yeah, it's great. I mean, so tell me about Formula One then, and your difficulties staying neutral. Do you have a particular driver that you're really rooting for, or one that you're sort of perhaps rooting against?
It's more difficult because I've just been watching it longer, and you have a better idea of what makes a good driver, what makes a great driver, and what definitely makes a bad driver. And when someone comes in, regardless of the reasoning, you still pretty much most of the time know, after having watched it for an inaudible amount of years, that they're going to be either they're going to be good or not. And for the most part, I think I've probably been right 9 times out of 10. And I'd like to be proven wrong occasionally a bit more, because you love that surprise coming. It's kind of, we're recording this a couple of weeks after the Brazilian Grand Prix. No one's going to predict that Alpine are going to get a double podium. You know, even Alpine aren't predicting that at the end of the day. So I love it when these sorts of things happen, but most of the time you know that you're not going to be doing that. You're not going to be seeing that from certain drivers, and that's where the controversial opinions sometimes come in, and you get called harsh, and you get called, oh, you don't love the sport enough. It's like, no, it's not that. It's just, I always say that you can like a driver, or you can love a driver, but that doesn't mean that they're a good driver. It just means you like them as a person, and it's trying to separate those two from each other. And it's the most heartfully devastating one of those recently has been Daniel Ricciardo, because no one, I mean, outside of Australia, probably no one wanted him to succeed more than me in some respects, because you know what he's done in the past. You know he's not forgotten how to drive. You know that he's got it still within him, but for some reason it just doesn't come together on occasion. And unfortunately, he ran out of time before he was able to do anything with it, and that's where it gets a bit difficult, because you really want to. It's a driver where you know that they can do well, and they're just not able to for whatever reason. Whereas with other drivers, you think, I'd like to be proven wrong, but I'm probably not going to be. And that's nothing against the drivers themselves. I'm sure they're nice people. I've got nothing against them, but you've got to really look at it with that cold rationality that a commentator or a spectator has, where, yes, you're a fan, but you've got to have kind of an objective opinion from it if you want to do a podcast or write an article where you're taking it seriously, because you've got so many content creators out there, like we were saying earlier, where they can take a very blasé approach to it, and they can just rip in and tear a driver new one. And okay, yeah, I have done that on occasion on the Undercut podcast. We do throw between silliness and seriousness, but it's never from a place of malice or anything like this. And I think when you've got someone like Lewis Hamilton, you know that if he has a bad day, chances are it's not be because of him. You're more likely to give him the benefit of the doubt and say it's the car, or it's the conditions, or it's something else, rather than it being him as a driver. Whereas if you take someone, I'll be mean, let's be controversial, like Valtteri Bottas, I don't know what he was expecting to achieve at Sauber. when he moved there, in my opinion, he should have just retired after he left Mercedes and maybe gone off into some other motorsport series. I'd like to see him in NASCAR, IndyCar, or maybe an off-road thing. It seems more kind of his cup of tea, especially with the look and the vibe he goes for these days. And it's one of those things where I'd like to be proven wrong, but given the car and given the driver, you know that combination's probably not going to give you what you need. And you see some drivers like Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button back when you had the McLaren Honda, terrible car, but they dragged it into places it had absolutely no right being. But if you swapped them out for someone else, they wouldn't be able to get it there. And sometimes you have the bad luck on the other side of it. You look at Zhou Guanyu over the last couple of years. What was he ever going to be able to do in that car? Probably not an awful lot. Does that mean he's a bad driver? No. Does that mean that he deserves a spot at a team higher up? Also, possibly no, because you need to have those drivers where they can do what Alonso or Button did with that McLaren Honda and drag it into a place, even if it's just occasionally, into a position where it has no right being. You look at George Russell when he was at Williams. He did it. He didn't do it every weekend, but when the opportunity was there, he managed to do it. You look at Alex Albon again with the Williams. He'd take chances. The team would trust him to do a more outlandish strategy and get 1 point out of 6 races, but that 1 point would be a hell of a good point. And I think if you put someone like Oscar Piastri in the Sauber, they'd have at least 1 point this year so far. And you thought if they were ever going to do it, it would be at Brazil. And if Bottas can't do it, then no offense, Joe, but what is Joe going to be able to do? So it's this sort of thing of, I don't dislike them as individuals. They're probably quite nice and I'd like to meet them one day. But maybe this iteration of racing isn't for you. Maybe this racing series isn't best suited to your style. And there are other people waiting in the wings that would be better suited for that. But trying to keep all that clear is difficult. And that's why I'm particularly glad we don't record our reviews straight after a Grand Prix and we wait until the following evening, because that gives you a bit of time to make sure that the FIA haven't handed out any penalties to mess up the results again, and B, just to go, okay, let me look at that from a different angle, or my adrenaline has subsided, I can look at that a little bit more rationally right now, and maybe X driver hasn't been as stupid as I thought they were, and I need to just cool it and I can look at it a bit more seriously, but then still have that fun side to it.
No, I agree with you. But to be honest, that's part of the passion. The emotions run high when you're watching a race. I'm conscious of the time, but given you've been watching Formula One for some time, I'm really interested in this comparison. So if you look at the top 6 racing drivers in Formula One standings at the moment, Max Verstappen's obviously in first, but then the next 6 drivers have never won a world championship. So I wonder, let's say, if you could tell me who you'd be most confident is going to win a world championship in their career, and perhaps who might not. So we've got Norris, Leclerc, Piastri, Sainz, and Russell, all with pedigree, all now with race wins. Who do you think, perhaps of that group, and you're going to tell me it's car dependent, and I agree, do you think it's the kind of the guy that stands out to you as, okay, they're more likely to win a championship in their career, and perhaps who isn't?
It's interesting you say car dependent, because for me, Ferrari didn't have the car all season in 2022, but I still think if Leclerc had been the driver today that he is, if he was the driver then that he is now, he would have been able to. And I think that's the true sign of an exceptional world champion. You see that with Jenson Button in 2009. The car dropped off, but he was able to do just enough to keep it there to secure that title. And you're seeing it this year with Verstappen. That Red Bull is nowhere near the car that it was at the start of the year. And yet he's able to still do exactly what he needs to do and more to probably seal the title in Las Vegas. So for me, the top 2 from that list, who I would be most confident in winning a world championship, would be Leclerc and Piastri. Leclerc just because he's learned. He's been in position to win the title. He lost it partly through mistakes that he made, but he's not kind of just sat there and gone, well, that's me done, I can't do anything about it. He's taken time, he's matured, he's had some more difficult times, but he's endured it, and he's in a position now where, until the last race weekend where Verstappen did a Verstappen, he was still a fun outside chance for the title for this year, and the fact that we could even talk about that was just incredible. Piastri, if he doesn't win a title, I don't know what the hell's happened, to be honest. He's at least got a couple of championships in him. He's just one of those drivers. We talk about Lewis and Michael and Vettel and Max now. Piastri is the next one. He's going to be the next big one of those, and it doesn't need to be immediate. He's still only about 15, so we've got plenty of time with him for him to do it several times, and it doesn't need to be back to back to back. He can do it 1 year, miss out on the next two, and then come back and win 3 on the trot if he really wants to. He's that kind of a cool, level-headed driver already. You saw what he did in his rookie season. It's the best rookie we've had since Hamilton. If he's not going to become champion, I don't know what's going on there. And I think he's a driver where you could stick him in a Sauber or a Williams or an Alpine, and he wouldn't get points every race, but he would be getting the majority of the points for that team. He'd be doing what Alonso's doing in the Aston Martin that Stroll clearly isn't. As for the rest on that list, Sainz and Russell, I wouldn't be surprised if they got a championship, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. They're in that kind of, they've got the potential for it, but I don't know if they'll get the opportunity to it. Arguably, Sainz is about to lose that opportunity, and as much as I would love a Williams renaissance to sweep us for the next 20 years at least and bring back the glory days, I'm just not sure it's going to happen when Sainz is there, unfortunately. Russell, again, awkwardly, he had his time at Williams to get him ready for Mercedes. Then as soon as he joined Mercedes, they dropped off. So he's in this awkward no man's land now of, does he stay and hope that they can get better, which they show potential of occasionally, or does he jump ship? But I think as a driver, he's a little bit like Leclerc was a couple of years ago. He's not there yet, but he's on the right path to it. And I think mistakes like Singapore last year, he'll learn from that. You don't want to be losing. You'd rather lose a race win now than lose a championship because of that later. And I think he's smart enough to know that. And he's also teammates with Hamilton, who he's going to be learning a lot from him. And he's beating him this year, and he beat him last year and in 22 in some respects. It was never always a kind of a slam dunk, but over the course of a season, he was doing a lot better matching up against him than a lot of people were thinking of. So those would be the two there, which I think just leaves Norris, which is where it gets interesting, because for me, and this will be the controversial, but if he continues as he is, no, I don't think he's going to win a championship. I think this year has been the best opportunity he's had for it. And as much as you could say the team have made blunders across the year, he's also made a fair few. And everyone goes on about the title fight being really close between them. But you think about it, they've only really fought once, and that was in Austria, and that didn't really go too well. He's not... Look, I think this is where Leclerc comes back into it in terms of he was wheel-to-wheel with Verstappen from the very start in 2022, and he won and he lost. And it was kind of through the endurance of that season. You look at France as being the key point there, where he arguably lost the season when Verstappen was hunting him down, and maybe it was just the pressure that got to him at that point. But he has since learned he knows what to expect from Verstappen, and he's got Verstappen's respect now, so that when they do fight, Verstappen knows he's not necessarily going to be able to get away with some of his classic hijinks, if we phrase it like that, in the same way that Lewis always knew that if you're going to try this, I'm willing to go there as well. So if you're going to take me out, I'm bringing you with me. So you can't do that unless you're willing to try, unless you're willing for that to happen. Whereas Leclerc's got this more elegant battle. He'll get really close, but he'll just manage to squeeze out of the last moment. He won't need to go there, but he's willing to. Whereas Norris at the moment, I feel like he's still a bit too rough around the edges, and I don't know what's going to happen with him. We don't know after next year, arguably, who's going to have the best car, who's going to be having the best team after the car. Because you can have the best car, but if your strategy's not there, it's not going to do you any good. And if you don't have the drivers equally, it's not going to do anything. So I think he's the least likely of that group for me that's going to be a world champion. And I think he needs to go through the same kind of learning process that all the other drivers have gone through there. Aside from Piastri, Piastri is just a natural talent, and he's going to be a multiple world champion.
Well, I mean, you talked about maybe agreeing quite a lot on your podcast, but I can't disagree much with what you said there.
You're so kind.
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. So let me ask you one final motorsport question before we start to wrap, because you said that we can't predict what's going to happen after next season because, the cars are going to change. But what about next season? If you had to bet your farm on 2025 World Drivers' Champion in Formula One, who would you go for?
That's where the tricky bit comes in, because there's what I want to happen and there's what I think will happen. If we kind of see a similar convergence that we've seen over the course of this year, then we're in for a hell of a year next year. And from a purely narrative perspective, and it kind of marries with what I want and what I think will happen, I wouldn't at all be surprised to see Ferrari clinch at least one title. But at the same time, I think Hamilton gets the World Championship with Ferrari, but McLaren get the Constructors, because I think Ferrari might just nab it this year from them, and that'll be a wake-up call for them to get their act together and go, we could have had both here, and we've somehow ended up with neither. We need to sort that out. So Hamilton for the drivers and McLaren for the Constructors.
Oh my God, you've just put me in dreamland. I've learned not to hope as someone that sort of followed Hamilton.
Yeah, this is as a Ferrari fan as well. So you can see the pain we've had to go through for the last far too long.
Well, you were kind of saying at the beginning that one of the first sort of memories you have of Formula One is, why aren't both Ferraris at the front? And I think that certainly my childhood spoiled me into thinking that Ferrari were, historically successful. But if you look back through the years, it was probably just Michael Schumacher, Ross Brawn, and the gang, and John Todd turning up, gave them an unprecedented period of success that they hadn't had really in their past, and they haven't really had since. So, fingers crossed.
I say it's been almost, I think, at least, if not longer, in terms of the amount of time between those championships that we're due one, at least, even if it's just a one-off. So yeah, take what we can get.
Absolutely. I remember as a kid, the stat was always, the last Ferrari world champion is Jody Scheckter in 1979. And I was not alive in the 70s, I'll have you know, so it already seemed a long time ago. And so, yeah, it feels like we're overdue. But there we are. Brilliant. So we've talked about your podcast. You're clearly passionate about motorsport. I'm sure that our listeners will love to kind of follow and hear what you're up to. So where can they find you? Where's the best place to track you down?
Easiest place to see everything and then find everything else from there will be Instagram. So that'll be t.albers.daly on the Kerbs. I'll probably find a snappier way of phrasing that at some point, but for now that's what it is. You can find all the links to all the podcasts, all the Instagram exclusive interviews there, and basically anything I do I will publish and promote in some way, shape or form through that profile.
Interesting. This man knows something. Instagram must be the place to get traffic onto your content. Very good.
We're trying.
Yeah, well, no, I'm sure you're doing well. Brilliant. And we always ask our guests before we go, do you have a final message for perhaps, like, if you were thinking about yourself 5 years ago, just before you got into Drive Tribe and journalism, like what message would you give people that were in your shoes that 5 years ago?
It's going to be cliche, but give it a go. Because you never know where it's going to lead you. I mean, I started out thinking, it's just fun to get that passion out, to write it all down somewhere. And the fact that then people started engaging with it and interacting and building a community out of it and getting friends out of it, that a few of which are probably going to be lifelong friends, and then getting to interview the sheer number of people that I've done or interviewed already. And that's not even counting like the big names. That's just some of the genuine, really nice conversations that we were saying about earlier, where you just get along from the go, not just because you have to, but because there is just that natural, that chemistry. I think you've got to give it a go, because you never know where it might end up. So if you told me that I'd be still doing it 5 years ago, I'd be going, well, that's worked out a bit better than you probably thought. And also that's pretty fun, because again, you think, just say some names back to past me and go, yeah, you've talked to these people, you've met these people. That's just casually what you're doing on a Wednesday afternoon or whatever. Doesn't seem too bad. So you've got to give it your shot. You've got to shoot your shot. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but you'll have some cool stories at the end of it, hopefully.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. Now we take the tone down a notch and we ask you our important question that we've asked everyone, including Mario Andretti. He had a particular answer, being an Italian, but I presume just on occasion that you enjoy pizza every now and then, right?
I had a feeling I knew where this was going when you mentioned the Italian, but go on.
Yeah. So, pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
Criminal. Should not be allowed.
You're probably the most staunch anti-pineapple guest we've had, and that's including Mario, who also gave that sort of vibe. Are you secretly
It's what we're
Italian? Do
going to
we need
bond
to?
on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Do we need to know?
I've interviewed a lot of Italians. Maybe some of it's come through, and it's the Ferrari fan coming out of me as well. It's just
Yeah.
maybe that's just automatically that. Yeah, no, not under no circumstances. Just eat,
So
just
what's
have it separately if you really want it, but just don't put it on it.
What's hilarious, because people listening will only be hearing the audio. Your facial expression was dead serious. You'd think that
Pained.
Thiemo was joking. Yeah, yeah. It's like, no, it's criminal.
I saw a video the other day of these Americans making a cup of tea, and everything about that just offended me on a personal level. And I feel like it's not there, but it's a very close second.
Well, it's funny that you have the podcast Across the Pond, because part of me thinks it could be the name of like a diplomatic mission, and it feels like
Not
there's
if
at
they're
least
making
one
tea
mission.
like that.
Yeah, right. It needs to be an educational program for making tea, and possibly something to do with no pineapple on pizza. But there we go. Brilliant. Well, Thiemo, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. Guys, if you've made it this far into the show, because I'm terrible at marketing, then please give us a thumbs up, a like, a 5-star review if that's still a thing. I'm a bit old. But most of all, give us a comment. Come and find us at Strip the Dip on Instagram to some extent, but definitely on X as well. We love to hear what you think, but also, tell us who you want on next. But until next time, I've been F1 Blag. This has been Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. Good night.